You're listening to the Ask Drone U podcast. You ask, we answer your drone questions. Whether you're here to turn your passion into profit or you simply fly for fun, we're a community of learners and teachers who aspire to achieve greatness. We are
Drone U.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask Drone U. Welcome to Drone U HQ.
Indeed, thank you for joining us, spending a few minutes of your very busy day with us. We appreciate it so much. We know that you have a ton going on. And you know how we know that, because the people that are listening to this are the people that are always trying to grow and get better and do more and make more of their lives. Those are the kind of people that invest in podcasts. And so we know you're busy. And so thank you for spending a few minutes of your day. We take that seriously, and we're going to do our best to give you some valuable information. And one of the ways that information sort of starts is by the questions that you ask at askdroneu.com. So hop on there and ask a question, please.
Definitely hop on there. Today's show is really going to be focused around a question regarding surveying, which I feel like definitely deserves a little prerequisite. That's not the right word, but a little disclaimer, I think is
a PSA?
Yeah. But a disclaimer that, this particular caller called in as he is employed by a surveyor.
Apparently, it seems that way, yeah.
It does apparently seem that way. It's also important to note that as drone pilots, in order to do surveying work, you either have to be hired by a surveyor, aka working directly under them, or you are a surveyor, I guess is the only other way to do it. Now, that said, surveying law is very different in many states. Some states understand that the advent of the drone is very similar to GPS and are accepting it and learning about it and learning how to use it. And some other states are extremely protectionist and going after everyone they can. So it is important for us to have a disclaimer and to make sure that all of you are aware that surveying is a kind of a protected, quote unquote, industry, very, very, very kind of older industry, ripe for disruption, as I continue to say.
True.
But today's question is really focused on how to really understand the plausibility of utilizing drones for surveying in pretty much, smaller areas, right? Like a half an acre, a third of an acre, pretty much a standard size property for suburban America. And with that said, when we typically talk about drones and surveying, I mean, you go on the internet, you look at the comparables, you're talking normally numerous acres, not kind of smaller plots of land. And I'm actually very excited for this show, Rob, because it provides an opportunity to kind of explain, how photogrammetry works and the limitations of it, and how, maybe potentially changing our acquisition strategy would yield very, very different results as far as the plausibility of doing this. Now, that said, why are a lot of surveyors turning to drone pilots, hiring drone pilots in mass? I mean, just go look at Florida. Holy cow. The reason is that it's very easy to scale doing these home or mortgage surveys when you have drones. It makes it a lot easier to find the right information and document it. So
yeah.
That said, I know, we had done some research with one of our friends, Jason, down in Florida, who's now at a new firm, I believe, if that's right. I might be wrong about that. But that said, when we went through data, we found that about 1 in 3 of previous mortgage surveys had some sort of human error after the drone survey was done and could show that. So, you never know how your property value might be going down in your appraisal because some surveyor couldn't find the right pin and couldn't get to that corner of the property. And now you just lost a whole lot of money on your appraisal for your property that you're trying to sell. But don't worry, it doesn't matter because the real estate market is at an all-time crazy level. So you'll probably still get $200K over asking. So don't worry.
Absolutely, yeah. At least for now.
Yeah.
So sell quick.
Yeah. But anyway, just thought it was important to showcase that disclaimer, and hopefully we can provide some value to this caller, and hopefully we can also provide clarity and provide information, because I think that, when we go after people for not knowing something and then we punish them for it, I don't think that the true macro effect is understood when that dichotomy is at scale. So anyway.
I agree.
Hi, I'm Jerry from Houston, Texas. I am a field surveyor doing home property survey, getting boundary lines, topo, and house floor finish level. Typically, my projects are below half an acre. So I search a lot of videos of drone survey, but all of them showing vast land like more than 10 acres. So my question is, drone survey for small properties can be done. Keep in mind the client has neighbors around his or her property, and there's some trees all around the property. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Really appreciate you taking the time to call in. And I think Paul definitely has some thoughts for you. AskDroneU.com is where Jerry asked his question. And this is a good one. We definitely know something along the lines of what he's asking is happening in Florida, right?
Yeah.
At a mass scale. So yes, it's happening.
In
Yes,
Texas
it's doable.
too, yeah.
In Texas too.
Mm-hmm.
And probably other places. But what's Jerry got to think about?
If I understand his question right, he's essentially asking about the plausibility of using drones in Houston, which has some limitations compared to other areas of the United States, if not the world. And one of those things, it's a highly vegetated area.
Yeah.
And, when we're talking about surveying, typically the drones are flying a single grid flight path with a nadir camera angle. So essentially, our camera is straight down. And the reason that we do that is because when our camera is straight down, we have the least amount of distortion in the images and can create the best bare earth model. But the problem with nadir acquisition strategies is that, well, twofold. Number one, it's very difficult to see the corners of complex or buildings that have complex geometry, right?
Yeah.
Or a lot of right angles and corners and whatnot. And when you have trees right next to these buildings, oftentimes it can be difficult to ensure that you've got, every corner of the building in at least 3 to 4 images. Now, I would say based off of Pix4D's lackluster releases here in the last couple of months, that you'd really want 4 images. After they changed from 4.4 and they really tried making the step 1 engine more efficient, I think they've really taken a lot away from Pix4D, in all honesty. That's just between me and you. And the audience. So, so anyway, that said, this is also why we teach on Drone Deploy in our mapping class, and we're moving into other softwares as well.
And still teach on Pix4D as well, though.
Yeah, because it's still the best. But anyway, how does photogrammetry really work? Well, in order to understand how photogrammetry really works, you've got to do something. So, for example, let's do this with Rob. I do this in class all the time. Okay. Rob, how far is that wall that the TV is mounted on from us? So how far is that wall that the TV is mounted behind the camera? You guys can't see it. How far is that wall?
16 feet.
Okay. Every single time someone answers with a known quantity in feet.
A round number.
Thank you. A round number, yes. You never hear someone say, that wall is 17 feet, 3 3/4 inch away.
Yeah.
You know why?
With a margin of error of
standard deviation of 1.2.
Right.
Exactly. Anyway, long story short is everyone always answers with a round whole number, right? And why is that? Because we only have 2 eyes, which presents us with this problem of parallax, whereas essentially the size, shape, and position or orientation of an object can essentially look different depending on where we're looking from, okay? With photogrammetry, the way that we have to overcome this is by having a vast amount of overlap in our images, right? When we talk about a single grid, we talk about a double grid, what we're really talking about is an autonomous flight plan to ensure that the drone is taking images at a very sequential manner to ensure that we have a high level of overlap. Because when we have a high level of overlap, it's kind of like having 4 or 5 eyes when we're calculating the distance from that wall. Right? We can utilize a lot more information to reduce the ellipsoid error to fundamentally understand how far away that wall is with a much higher degree of depth perception, which is why we need such a high level of overlap. Okay. Now that said, typically the way that Pix4D, Drone Deploy, Maps Made Easy, a lot of these other engines work is that they look for unique points and pixels in your images. And then when they see that same unique point across multiple images, you essentially get a tie point. Once that point is georeferenced, now it becomes a point in a point cloud, okay? So that said, typically Pix4D, Drone Deploy, they have to see that same unique point in multiple images, and they call that the match rate. So essentially, you have to have 3 matches or 4 matches or 5 matches. And when you get that, that's when the point actually makes it in the point cloud. Well, let's go back to what is the surveyor tasked with? They are tasked with showcasing the property lines and then the proximity of the house to the property lines, right? What is the overall square footage of the property minus the square footage of the home? That's pretty much what they're after. Now, they typically go look for these little metal pins that are in the corner of the property. And whether a surveyor is using a drone or not, they're typically going to mark those pins, shoot it with their RTK receiver, and make sure that the accuracy of those points is still accurate today. But then the hard work comes in that they've got to go shoot now the corner of pretty much at every corner of the house, shoot where the pool is, and shoot a bunch of different points to create this essential topo. That takes a lot of time when you're walking around with one of those RTK receivers, right? You can shoot all 4 points and then use a drone to essentially create all of your lot lines and for you once you have that base ground controlled information, okay? That said, because Pix4D and these other softwares are looking for a certain number of matches, we have to ensure that we can see the corner of that building in at least 4 images so that the corner of the building shows up in the map and so that we can measure that point in proximity to the known points that were pulled from the pins, okay? And so that said, when you're dealing with high levels of vegetation and we can only map what we can see, this often means that when it would typically be easier to use a drone, sometimes it's not easier to use a drone because you can't always capture enough photos of a corner to ensure that it's in your map. Now, the way that most drone pilots get around this is by shooting a single grid nadir, so they have their perfect ground controlled layer. They've used some sort of GCPs. We're assuming again that we're not using the P4 RTK because of this one specific reason, which highlights exactly why if you're a surveyor and you already have RTK or PPK equipment, there's no point in buying that drone because you run into one of these problems where as the camera tilts and you get past a certain degree of tilt, you no longer have a fix on that image, and you can no longer accurately georeference that image from the data set of the P4 RTK, right? So the way that most people get around getting all the corners in the map is that they'll shoot a single grid, but then they'll also do a double orbit or sometimes a triple orbit. Now, why is that problematic for surveyors? Because surveyors are using drones to try to scale up and make their jobs more efficient so that they can do more of them so they can make more money, okay? Why is a single grid nadir with an orbital flight plan a bad idea when scaling surveying jobs? Well, because you have to tie those data sets together, whether you're merging projects together or whether you're aligning projects together, you have to merge those projects together. And by the way, I did finally prove that in Drone Deploy, because I was told otherwise, and I had to do a bunch of different data sets to figure this out. If you throw an orbit and a grid in the same project of Drone Deploy, it will not merge those together. Nope, it doesn't do it. So I know for a long time I said it did, but I finally got a few data sets that I could run over and over in different ways to prove the point. And so, as you know, we get these beautiful 3D meshes from Drone Deploy, and they are getting really good at that, frankly. But no one is going in and creating MTPs to say, hey, this corner of the sidewalk in the orbits is this corner of the sidewalk in the grids as well. Let's just merge those together, you know? And so creating those MTPs or GCPs and then merging those or aligning those data sets, merge is 2 projects, align is the same project. Whether you're merging or aligning, it's a lot more work to process that data and actually spit out something that's usable.
And when you say nobody is doing this, you're talking about the fact that with Drone Deploy, it's done in the cloud and you as the user don't have the ability to do that.
Correct.
The way that you do in Pix4D.
Correct. And also, I don't think Drone Deploy is paying anyone to create these MTPs
Correct.
or clean up the models. Yeah.
Nobody's on there floating in the clouds doing that.
For sure. Yeah. And so, Rob and I were talking about this, and I was like, how can I try to provide more value in this show to people who are thinking about using drones? They're surveyors or they work for surveyors, so they're familiar, with the language, they're familiar with the terms. And it just made me think, I actually believe the scalable means of mapping these types of homes, small acreage, vegetation, very minimal degree of elevation deviation. I honestly think that maybe we should be looking at surveying as a double grid, but nadir only, right? And then we increase the overlap, say from 75-75 to 90-90, and ensure that we're getting every corner of the building in at least 4 images. I used to say 3, but I feel like 4 is going to be more bulletproof of a formula for you. And if we could do that, then we can run all that data at once. We don't have to create any MTPs. The georeferencing is very easy. It's very simple. And you're not having multiple steps of processing that could potentially slow down the overall output and essentially slow down the overall scale. So the final succinct answer to his question is, let's say that you pull your pins and you marked, let's say, 4 or 5 GCPs, okay? And then you fly a double grid nadir at a 90-90, very high level of overlap. But the reason that we're flying nadir is so that we can always see between the trees and the building, that little easement, right? But we're also ensuring that we're capturing every single corner in at least 4 images, but that those images are shot at nadir, so we have the least amount of distortion in the images. Thus, we have the least amount of overall error in the images. And Rob, this all brings me to, we've got, I think, 3 or 4 surveyors in the afternoon mapping class right now, and I was going over how to mark GCPs and how human error can completely ruin RMS and all these things. And I have to say it's really, really fun to watch the understanding come through, and people say, oh, now I know why you say that on the show, because they can get it because they're doing this stuff in another sort of form every day. Yeah. And I finally got a chance to explain the reason that we mark GCPs changing a tire is to reduce the ellipsoid error and make sure that our ellipsoid is essentially plumb to the ground so that we have the least amount of distortion in marking. So anyway. So let me ask this, because if there is a lot of vegetation, Houston area as the example, and their primary purpose is boundary lines and the property and how the property sits, how the structure sits on the property. Mm-hmm. Would LiDAR not be a better option? If you don't need a pretty model. Well, this is actually a very poignant question because, as you know, LiDAR does penetrate vegetation, and LiDAR is actually a much simpler acquisition strategy. It's faster. You typically only fly a single grid ever, unless you're doing photogrammetry and then on top of the LiDAR. Right. I think the issue is that we don't have LiDAR that's compact enough and that has an easy enough workflow to do this. Okay. I know that we're using LiDAR more and more and more, but one thing, there is a very big problem with the emerging LiDAR community, at least the aerial LiDAR community. That big problem is this false dichotomy that if you can work very well in LiDAR, that you can work very well in photogrammetry. Because we beat out a couple of people on some 3D modeling jobs because I was able to explain to the client, well, that LiDAR guy might be telling you that they're doing photogrammetry, but let me explain it to you, and let me explain to you why it's not satisfactory, and let me explain to you, if this is your deliverable, why it's not going to work and how we can do better. And we won every job. Because it's just look, these guys don't understand the science of photogrammetry. It is a clear-cut formula. And when everyone is still flying double grids to make lifelike models, it's fundamentally understood that they actually don't know how to create lifelike models because there are other acquisition pathways that would be shorter in duration in acquisition, and provide much better coverage.
Well, and you can only map what you can see, right?
Bingo.
So the nadir's not going to give you
Bingo.
pick up a thing here and there.
And it's not what you can see, it's what the drone can see. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I was going to say obviously, but none of it's
Some
obvious.
people don't make that jump. So they're like, well, hold on, Paul, I can see it. I'm like, yeah, well, you got the remote in your hand. What about the drone? Can the drone see it? So anyway.
Oh, that's funny. Unless you're doing it FPV, but I'm just kidding.
Oh man, what if we were to get to a day where you could FPV a freaking survey? You cannot do that, okay? But also, there's one last thing I wanted to bring up. So I think that 90-90 single grid acquisition strategy could potentially be a more scalable means than doing a single grid with a dub orbit. Seriously. I haven't tried it though. That's speculative, but I believe that it would be faster and quicker. There's that commercial I mentioned in the show last week. It would be faster and quicker to just do a single grid high level of overlap with a nadir camera angle. That said, I have been seeing a big uptick on social media of new drone pilots drawing lot lines on their aerial photos. Okay. In certain states, by the way, even if you disclaim that these are an approximation and not the real lot lines and blah, 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 there are still certain states, California, that will come after you for doing that.
Are you talking about, sorry, go ahead. I
haven't done that. I'm talking about you take a real estate photo and you essentially, it's like
just put the red lines. We're seeing it from the Austin stuff all over the place.
Exactly.
That's
yep.
what you,
That's exactly right. That's
so they're
why
not supposed
I said
to do that.
They're not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
So okay, this is a perfect example, right? You have
that's lame though, but go ahead.
Hold on. You have people like the Board of Surveyors in California going after drone pilots for doing ortho mapping in construction sites. It's not even georeference. They're saying, you're stitching tunnels, so you're surveying. It's like, no, you protectionists. No, we're not. And also, it's a conflict of interest for you to come after me when you're slated to make more money when you have more fines for people. But this is an actual legitimate technology that surveyors are using. So I think that this is a conflict of interest, but they still go after people. Now, that said, it's a total oxymoron when you see how much stuff in California on Redfin and Zillow. Here's something that you could investigate, California Department of Surveyors. How come on Zillow, on every single property on Zillow, there's a photograph with the lot lines? Every single property. Now go make your money elsewhere. Okay? Because it's really annoying because you guys aren't even very good at it.
We know California needs some revenue. So maybe.
Seriously. So anyway, but that said, this is something that I think new drone pilots need to be aware of. Do not, if a realtor says, please draw lot lines on the photos, respectfully say, that is it's almost against the survey law in pretty much every state. And if you were to do that, you can be held liable for pretty significant fines. And it's not worth the stress. Take it from me, not worth the stress.
What sucks about that is that it is really helpful.
Oh, couldn't agree more.
As the viewer of the property to know what you're talking about. What if, taking this a little bit further, do you feel like we've answered Jerry's question?
Yeah, 100%.
So I think the bottom line is, yeah, he gave you way more than I expected in terms of, you can do the smaller plots of land.
One last thing is too, remember with the RTK, if you're shooting those orbits or whatever, that's a part of why it's not scalable, because you're having to merge those two projects together because the RTK can't shoot that fix when you're at an oblique. So I wanted to make sure that it was well known too that, there are a lot of even surveying jobs that the RTK is not good for because you don't have that free flight capability. You don't have the RTK capability after a certain degree of tilt when you shoot oblique. I forget what that certain degree is. Sorry.
No, I was just wondering if you so there's something, at least in New Mexico, probably something similar around the country called an improvement location report, right? Where it is essentially a survey of the property and where the lines are and the boundary lines. I wonder if you could superimpose that somehow and use that.
Oh, you could do it in QGIS or ArcGIS.
I know you can do it, but if that would be okay for purposes of Zillow or whatever, Redfin, whatever. I don't know the answer.
I think this comes back to the importance of standardization. Again, Miriam was making such a good point in the Drone Live News show that why has autonomous driving not really taken off? And she used the analogy of drones are more like the car industry than drones are like the aviation industry. She gave multiple reasons as to why. And, she gave the other example of how long has it been since we've had autonomous vehicles? And I guessed because I was like, okay, when I was 20, I learned that there was a drone before I was born, And so I was like 82, just like throwing it out there, right? And she's like 85. She's like, that was pretty good guess. And anyway, and we still don't have autonomous vehicles, right? And we don't have autonomous vehicles because we don't have a standardized perception of how these vehicles are going to operate, the standard distance that they're going to stop from the vehicle in front of them, et cetera, right? You have a bunch of different private companies coming up with a bunch of different ways to measure the environment and to make decisions. And it's this hybrid model, right? There's no standardization. And I really feel like the surveying industry could benefit from standardization when it comes to how to use these tools. And I don't think ASPRS is doing a good job. So anyone who comes out and like, well, ASPRS, I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think they're there yet. I think they're doing a good job. I think they're trying to get there. I think it's very far away. And I think that we also need to understand standardization for things like what you just mentioned, right? Because there is a key element to market dynamics here. And I give the example of Airbnb, right? Airbnb, for a very long time, people were like, wait a minute, you can rent someone's house? Like, what? Mm-hmm. Not a hotel? And now everyone's like, screw hotels, I want a house, and Airbnb is huge. And if we remember was 17 or 18, and every government on the East Coast was going after Airbnb for taxation purposes, et cetera, because they're not technically a hotel, right? They completely changed the perspective of travel and leisure, 100%. In surveying, I think the same thing is going to happen with drones. Due to the lack of standardization, right? Drones are going to be coming in and, doing different tasks until someone standardizes it and says, this is how drones should be used. This is kind of when they're good, when they're not, et cetera. And when you have companies like Zillow, who would be a gold mine for the state of California Department of Surveyors, who are literally, putting lot lines over every single listing. They are changing the market dynamic because of exactly what you just said, right? You pull that up and it's very easy to understand. What am I actually buying?
It's great. It really is.
And here's the thing. I don't think the surveying community should be pissed by that, because at the end of the day, that data should have originated from some state overlaid map, which is what Zillow was pulling from anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So at what point are these boards going after people for drawing lot lines on photos when Zillow does it for every single property that's ever listed right now because it helps buyers? They are changing the market dynamic and perception, and they're doing it faster than the surveying industry, which could negatively affect the surveying industry's ability to enforce against lot lines, because the public at heart, who's really in charge of the laws? Oh yeah, it's society. Okay. And I give the example, no. It's a very dangerous thing. I agree. But I give the example.
Theoretically.
Yeah. I give the example of texting and driving. I passed at least 13 people today texting and driving.
Yeah.
Okay. None of them got pulled over. Okay. And there were a lot of cops this morning on Paseo.
That's very dangerous.
So I think texting and driving is more dangerous than a lot of things with guns, but I'm not going down that rabbit hole. So
yeah, let's not. No, it's that's a beast when you talk about changing an industry and comparing it to the taxation of Airbnb revenues, because they actually thwarted that pretty quickly all over the country, right?
Yeah, but why, right? I think it's because of people wanted this, right? It became evident to people that this was valuable, that it was protectionist of what was trying to go on with the regulators, and they weren't about it. I think people were like, you're trying to fool us, and we're not being fooled right now. I think the same exact thing is happening in the surveying industry. And I might get in trouble for saying that, but
I don't, well,
I actually, no, I
don't think
probably
you'll get
won't.
in trouble, but
Might get a letter certified, but who knows?
Ruffling a few feathers has always been a sport.
You know what? I know some people don't like it when I hold other people accountable, but I mean, look, I do this because I hold myself accountable too. I mean, you have seen that on this show. And in an effort to grow, we have to be able to have conflicting conversation to objectively identify both sides of an issue, to objectively come up with a solution that objectively works and is mutually beneficial for everybody.
On that bombshell.
That's going to do it for us today. My name is Paul.
I'm Rob.
I really went on a rant today. Sorry.